Okay, so we are going to look at the contrasts between productivities in the three different regions we looked at. We'll just stick to the northern hemisphere and look at the tropics, the mid-latitudes, and the polar regions. So this you already saw, but just makes it clearer. So tropics, light is available pretty much the whole year. There are differences because things like the monsoon season can bring enough clouds to affect productivity. Nutrients are low, but they can be available most of the year because corals, for example, are recycling things and having primary production throughout the year. Upwelling has a season. If you remember, the ITCZ moves and trade winds get stronger and weaker, so the upwelling in the East Pacific, for example, is the strongest in July, August, September, which means the primary production will be the strongest. But on average, you can think of tropics as having a generally low production but no seasonality. So not light limited, nutrient limited. So if you move north to the northern mid latitudes, obviously we already talked about how sun moves north after the spring equinox and then light begins to be available. During the winter months, the mixing and nutrient entrainment has prepared the system, so as soon as sunlight becomes available, stratification happens, nutrients are concentrated in the euphoric zone, you get a bloom that happens in spring. There is a delayed response by the zooplankton which graze it down, and then as the sun begins to move south again, we will see the animation next that shows how the surface begins to cool and then mixed layer deepens. There is entrainment of nutrients once more. Sun is still in the same hemisphere, so there is enough light, so you get a secondary bloom in fall, which is much weaker than the strong spring bloom because the nutrients have been reduced as well. Okay. In the polar regions, as we said, well mixed, no thermocline, nutrients are always available, no nutrient limitation. As soon as light becomes available, you can see that the spring bloom in the mid latitudes happens more in March, April, whereas in the polar regions it's delayed to May, and the peak is very strong. So essentially you will have to look at the area under these curves to estimate the total primary production. Okay, so that is got a grazing down by the zooplankton into the summer months, and the zooplankton population obviously peaks with a delay. So this animation here is going to show both the stratification changes, zooplankton, phytoplankton changes, and the nutrient, sunlight, phytoplankton, zooplankton changes. So you focus on one thing at a time. I lost my cursor here, but let me push it here, and you can see nutrients at the top, high in winter, and as sunlight is beginning to increase in this yellow line, nutrients are being consumed because phytoplankton is taking off, and the peak happens in spring, and then the zooplankton respond with a delay and they increase. They chow down on the phytoplankton, and you can see the biomass of the zooplankton has to be less than the phytoplankton, right? So we will see this in the allometric scaling again a little bit later. So in the summer, the zooplankton population is falling, the nutrients have been used up, phytoplankton has been grazed down, sunlight is maximum but productivity is minimal. And then as the sun begins to go south after hitting the Tropic of Capricorn and having the equinox, which means the return in September, the temperatures begin to cool again as sunlight reduces and leads to mixing, entrainment, and nutrients begin to increase. So there's a combination of light and nutrients that allows a secondary bloom in fall. I'm repeating, but it's worth remembering because this is kind of the most complicated seasonality that we are looking at. Okay, so let's look at now at the bottom figure, which is showing that in the winter you have low temperatures, isothermal, and it gets stratified as sun comes in spring months. So thermocline strengthens, the concentration of nutrients in the euphoric zone happens, phytoplankton bloom, zooplankton bloom, and in the fall, as the sun goes back north, you can again see weakening of the thermocline back to a well-mixed ocean, and you get that secondary bloom. There are also some phytoplankton here, diatoms, coccolithophores, and dinoflagellates. This is a mix of diatoms and coccoliths. You can see diatoms basically have a system of two testa, they're called, and the cell is inside. As we said, these porous to let light, nutrient exchange and waste exchange and so on. And if you hide the phytoplankton and look at the zooplankton, you see colorful things with various appendages and different sizes. Now you can go back to your knowledge of the water viscosity and dependence of the species structure, size, etc. on the habitat where they are living, right? So you can look at the upper one and the lower one, and so this one is bigger, very few appendages. This one is smaller and has lots of very long looking fancy appendages, right? This one is in the middle, appendages plus bigger. This one is bigger with fewer appendages. So you can imagine which one is a cold species and which one is the warm species here, right? Warm water species here. This has to be living in low viscosity water, so it can float by using all these appendages, similar to this one. This one is big, doesn't care about buoyancy so much, which means it is in colder water, similar to this one. Okay, those are the kind of details you have to always be able to bring up in your mind to combine the physics, temperature dependence of viscosity, etc., and the species evolution, production. And talking about production, here is the map of the mean production on the globe. So this is again CVIFS, Sea Viewing Wide Field of View sensor, which measured both terrestrial and marine biospheres, the green colors and yellow colors on land. For example, here is desert, here are the forests, Amazon forest, and so on. And because it's annual mean, it's showing high production at high latitudes in both hemispheres, but obviously there is a strong seasonality, as we saw in the animation. And to remind our trivia again, ocean color shows the geographical equator because the upwelling and the phytoplankton bloom is maximum on the equator, unlike rain, cloudiness, winds, etc., which are off the equator. Okay, and open ocean upwelling, there is production, but it's not as high as coasts and high latitudes. Okay, Indian Ocean is special because of the monsoon circulation. This is showing mean production here along the coast, which means the southwesterly winds during the summer monsoon produce strong Somali upwelling, as we saw. In the winter, the currents reverse, but the winds are actually coming from land. They will be drier and colder in the winter, so they cool the surface and again weaken the stratification and cause some mixing. So there is a winter bloom as well, which is in the middle of the ocean because it's not coastal upwelling, it's a surface convective mixing, it's called, because waters in the surface evaporate, get heavier, and they try to sink and mix, create nutrient entrainment. So this is an introductory course, so we didn't go into a whole lot of details, but you can use your fundamental knowledge of the few pieces of information of winds, Hadley cell, upwelling, coastal upwelling, open ocean upwelling, etc., to also produce more understanding and knowledge of why these are changing with season and region. For example, here we talked about the subtropical gyres, convergence, water going down, no nutrients. So these are the deserts of the ocean, the big blue patches, very low production. But again, remembering nutrients are higher below the water. If the surface is clear, sky is clear because it's high pressure, then water can radiation can penetrate, and you can get what are called subsurface blooms, Okay, we don't have a whole lot of information on subsurface blooms, but it's pretty much guaranteed from whatever little data we have that there is production below the surface if there is enough nutrient and light. Satellite only sees the upper ocean, but the lower ocean below, still in the euphoric zone, still has production, even in the so-called deserts where there is surface production is very low. Okay, fascinating biology always. I love biology. I hope you do too, because there is so much interesting information there.